With the 1988-89 school year approaching, there have been some vocal concerns by City Hall over how the city school district is spending their budget. As the move towards school reform continues, how will City Hall and the school board resolve their differences? That question begins the discussion on tonight's 2740. Good evening. Well, the dust has settled to a certain extent, but the mayor and City Hall expressed some serious concerns this year before passing the school budget. Joining us tonight on 2740, Mayor Tom Ryan, Peter McWalters, Superintendent of Rochester City Schools, Councilwoman Ruth Scott, Scott chairs the Finance and Law Committee, and Benjamin Douglas, President of the School Board. Mayor Ryan, let's begin with you. The Fiscal Independence Agreement assures that, while City Council allots the money to the school board, they can spend it any way they wish. Is there a fine line, though, between saying that they can spend it any way they wish and then saying that they're spending too much money?
Well, it isn't just a question of living within the Fiscal Independence Agreement. That I think you have to assume that decisions that are made now, this year, this budget year, are going to have an impact 2, 3, 4 years from now. And I think one of the things that probably disturbs some of the council members and members of the administration, I can't think of any city council in the last 25 years or any city administration that's been as supportive of education as we have. And if you look back, I think when I was sworn in 2.5 years ago, I made the comment then that there was nothing more important to the long-term success of the city than an effective, efficient city school district, and that was one of our major concerns. I think within about 3 or 4 months of that swearing in, we initiated discussions for a new fiscal independence agreement, which reflected the changes in Moore and Ryan as far as the sales tax is concerned. And that agreement will give the school district over $100 million over the next 10 years. So that I think in terms of support for education, you know, and I think Councilwoman Scott probably over the last 20 years is probably one of the, I think in terms of council members, one of the more supportive of the city school district. But we can have fiscal independence agreement that make annual allocations between the city and the city school district. That does not relieve city council or the city administration of the overall responsibility for the long-term financial well-being of the city. And we've spent the last 15 years digging ourselves out of a hole because of the Hurd, Walter, Angelone decision. Matter of fact, we aren't out of it yet. We still have about $35 million that we have to worry about paying back. But I think that's the type of decision we have to be concerned about. So that what we have said is that, first of all, we're concerned about the taxpayer. The last 4 years we've seen large increases in sales tax because of Moore and Ryan. That will be capped very shortly. We've seen big increases in state aid, and I think that if you go down to Albany, the chairman of the Education Committee will tell you that over the last 10 years, the only mayor of the big 6 cities that lobbies with the school district for increase in aid to education is Tom Ryan. So that you know, we've had big increases. And our concern is what is going to happen. The one revenue source that the school district or the city controls is the real property tax levy. So if there's any dramatic reductions in sales tax or in the state aid formula, and I can't find anybody who thinks that state aid is going to go up 14.5% or 15% indefinitely like it has over the last 5 or 6 years. What is a school district going to do, in other words, to make up the difference with decrease in state? And I think last year they had a $9 million cut in programs, even though the total budget went up $22 million. So that what we proposed was a study by the Senate that took at the long-term impact. And I think that, and despite this record of support I think that we've had, when we raise questions, I mean, we're immediately labeled anti-education. I think that's the part that bothers us the most. I mean, it's inconsistent with the record we've had, really.
Peter McWalters, were you surprised at some of the concerns raised over the size of your budget this year?
No. Was I surprised at the concerns over the issues raised at the side? No. No, there's nothing I could disagree in with Tom. I think the orientation is exactly right. If you go for a 15-year perspective, financing city services, city and school district, has been a well-documented battle. If you take a look at what the city leadership has done as part of trying to support education financially over the last 3 or 4 years. The redefinition of the fiscal independence agreement, the success of Moore and Ryan, and then the money's flowing to the city. I don't think that's even the issue. I think the issue is, just as Tom said, that we are living within a fiscal independence agreement, and there's an agenda that suggests that we're not servicing all kids. And there's so many ways to cut this. I'm sitting here thinking, all right, right this minute, after all is said and done last year, our unit cost for a student is $6,700. Now, you can say, my God, that's $2,000 or $3,000 above the national norm, which includes southern states and Alaska. But if you just take that frame of reference within the county or in western New York or New York, when all is said and done, we are not spending an extravagant amount of money on our children, and yet we're getting tremendous support for it. I'm not sure I would suggest that anybody's anti-education. I'm not sure where that reference came from. I don't think that's the perspective. I think the implication of how we're going to manage this over the long haul is a very real question, and the issues of how we communicate and kind of call for cooperation, those are very real issues.
Ruth Scott, when we're talking about actually going through this entire process and reviewing all the numbers and figures, when it comes right down to it, though, isn't the school board, as you, elected by the voters, and they've given them the authority to spend that much money?
Yeah, I think the issue, though, is not who has the authority to spend the money. It's who raises the money. And how do we come up to a reasonable agreement about how to spend the money over time, not programmatically, but how do we figure out how to have the best kind of situation both for city school district children and for their parents and the other people who exist in the city. I think it would be a travesty if we spent 90% of the budget on the school district, which we could certainly do. I mean, I'm sure there are needs that exist that could be conceivably met by spending additional dollars. But the problem is, if we did that, because we have a finite pie, if we did that, what would happen then is that the city would go to pot around the schools. And we would really be leading everybody down a garden path when we say we really are concerned about city children, but they don't have a community to live in that's worth living in. Or they don't have a community to live in where they can go out and get jobs after they finish their education. So it's a totality that we have to live with and that we have to look at. And I think all we're really asking at this point, at least as the dialogue has gone along, I think our redefinition of it is, what we're really saying is, let's take a look at this together in terms of the long-term implication of how you go about spending the dollars. Not what you spend it on specifically, but how do we do it in a more effective way for all of our citizens.
Benjamin Douglas, when we come down to debating how it's going to be spent and not getting into between City Hall and the school board a debate over programmatic changes or telling the school board how to spend. Are you looking at the long term, though? Are you looking at the taxpayer in the city, and can they afford this over 5 and 10 years? Or are you coming in every year and asking for the most money that you can get and spending it all?
Absolutely not. That's the purpose for the fiscal independence agreement, so that the city and the school district will not be in these kinds of conflicts. I like to say I agree with the points made about communications. I see the issue as one of communications between two governmental bodies that will determine what the stream of dollars are going to be available for what kinds of expenditures over the long haul. The school district has been actively involved from a state level in trying to judge what those revenues are, and every year we go through a process of lobbying, touching base with those points of information in Albany to find out what kinds of streams of dollars we can expect. We understand that we've been quite successful in the past and in the recent school year in obtaining fairly large amounts of monies from the state. We are not banking on those kinds of dollars in the future and how we spend those monies on programs. From the city point of view, we've sought to do the same thing with the fiscal independence agreement. We know as a school district that we have a mandate to reform schools. We know that the taxpayers in this city's ability to pay is not unlimited. So therefore we did sit down with the school with the city council, with the mayor, and we mapped out a program of expenditures, what dollars will be available to the school district to spend on school programs and so forth. And we've come up with the fiscal independence agreement. And we've lived through that according to the letter of the law and the spirit of that agreement. And I think what you're hearing now is that things may change in the future in terms of the taxpayers' ability to pay. There's concerns whether or not we can support that program based on what the potential projections might be. And I say that's a very legitimate question, and it calls for the two bodies to come together and talk about that.
Okay. Ben, I think there's a further question too, and I think that it's probably the basis for part of the philosophical discussion that's gone on over the last couple of years. The division of monies is not at question. I think there are some people who believe, and I won't say at this point what I believe, we'll just say there are some people who believe that when you have a tight fiscal budget, you really need to leave some room in that budget for unexpected events, like, for instance, a shortfall in state aid or shortfall in the sales tax or whatever may happen. Therefore, you should not budget all of the money that is allotted to you, so that if indeed you had a shortfall, you had something to fall back on, rather than having to come across the street and suggest to us that we need to cut back in order to make up that shortfall. I think that's part of the discussion that's going on, although I think you're right in your main characterization of it.
One of the reasons for the fiscal independence agreement was to give the school district the flexibility in terms of making some multi-year plans. And I think one of the points we've tried to make is that you don't have any flexibility now. In other words, you're taxing it at the limit. And so if there's any changes in the two revenues that you don't control, state aid or sales tax revenues, you don't have any place to go in terms of protecting a program. So that I think you're going to be back in the thing where you have a program start one year and going to be cut the following year. And I don't think that does anybody in the school district or the school administration any good. And I think that's the point. And secondly, the state aid increases, that's been 14, 15%. And each year that the governor has signed the bill, he has done it on the basis that it's to give relief to the local real estate taxpayers. And that's been the specific reason for it. And that hasn't happened here. So, and I think that's why we are concerned about leaving some taxing margin. And frankly, that isn't anything that we're asking a school district to do that we don't do ourselves.
Okay.
I mean, we have about $15 or $16 million in taxing authority that we don't use because we don't know what's going to happen in the future in terms of problem. And there are a lot of things we're concerned about. I said the $35 million for the tax refund. In 2 years, we'll be having another decennial census, which will have an impact on some of our revenues, I'm sure. We'll have the adjustment as far as the homestead, non-homestead categories, as far as the assessment rolls. These are major problems, and I think that we have to take some of the pressure off the real estate levy.
Okay.
Well, let me respond to that a second, please. I would say that there are points to that I would agree with the mayor, and that is the school district is seeking and has sought to create within its budget some reserves to do that. Now, we are limited on how much reserves we can put aside, but I don't think there is any disagreement on that point, and we seek to do that. As far as relief to the taxpayers, the school district, particularly the school board, our elected officials, live in the city and is every bit as much concerned as any other body of government about the burden on the taxpayer. Every year when money is appropriated from the state, the governor may have one thought, but the legislature, which really appropriates the monies and is the final decider of what dollars come to the district, appropriate on the basis of support to education. There is some feeling with, and I may not necessarily agree with this as a taxpayer, but there's some thought within the legislature that monies that they appropriate for education should not go to any other source but education, and some legislatures will balk on appropriating the large amount of monies that we're able to get if it goes for anything other than that. Now, that's not to say that the school district is not very sympathetic and in agreement with the mayor that their taxpayer must be considered.
Okay, Peter, I mean, it's been characterized as budgeting on the edge, and the suggestion is that you're not looking to the future. I mean, are we on a fast track for spending under the whirlwind of reform, and can we cut back, and can you cut back in future years if necessary? Once programs are institutionalized, they're hard to take away.
Unless they're ineffective, and I'd like to think that they can be. There's so many images I'm sitting here with. I think we started off okay. Everybody agrees that we need intergovernmental communication. It's got to be future-focused. Nobody wants to dabble in which programs we ought to provide, but there's some sense that there's a future that needs to be managed. Very good. And in that future, we have to decide priorities, big ones. Downtown development, schools, neighborhoods, fire, police, absolutely legitimate discussion. Then you start getting one layer below that, and there is concern about whether or not our programs are either the right programs or do we have contingencies to manage unknowns.
No, wait a minute. Didn't hear anybody say whether they're the right
Peter,
programs.
whatever we've been guilty of, we never questioned program decisions.
You are right about the fact that we said how you got to make a decision about the amount.
That's what I was suggesting. Isn't there a fine line between talking about how much money they're spending and talking about, but we're not talking about your programs in general. I mean, when you cut right down to it, he's saying that the funding is supporting programs he deems necessary and the school board deems necessary.
I'm putting this
Isn't
into
there
context.
a fine line in between there?
There was a question about the $9 million shift, even though a record increase, whatever. I mean, we cut $9 million out of the budget last year. Some of it was driven by the necessity of some federal programs that were over budget. That's an error. And we've said that was an error. The systems work to correct that have been done. Center for Governmental Research has verified it. That's under control. We also cut something like $2 million worth of efficiencies that we promised we would cut when we did secondary reorganization. We didn't get forced into a $9 million program reduction simply because of the reform movement. And I would suggest that when you go through the audit exercise that we go through jointly, the auditors don't tell us that what we're doing is bad business. So there is a sense on my part that this goes beyond a strategic discussion. But quite legitimately, more money has been coming, and Tom Ryan is the only mayor I know of that goes up to the state with us. And I know what the governor says, and Ben is right. The monies that have been coming to this city in state ed for the last 5 years have been not coming in the general fund area. They've been coming in the categorical area. We got $10 million worth of magnet school money this year. I'm not going to go to the people that did that. As a matter of fact, the first visitation is scheduled for the 1st of October. And I've got the list. They want to meet the teachers who are funded with magnet school funds. They want to be introduced to the program, and they want to visit each site. They want to visit the early childhood centers that we said we'd open with magnet school funds. There is a dilemma on that revenue side between lowering or protecting the tax rate and meeting the legislative obligation that you set up when you go lobbying. I'm only making the point that that it is complex and it needs a strategic cooperation. But I do think that in the strategic view, this issue, and I think it even got emphasized in this the housing study that just came out. You have this image that fewer people moving in have children. Does that mean that the schools are less, quote, needed? Well, you didn't say that, and the study didn't say that. You have an industrial commercial side that is saying, my God, the workforce isn't going to be there. We need the schools to be. You have the city paper that just came out with another story about the fact that no matter what anybody says, when people move, they ask about safety and neighborhoods or schools. The issue or the role that schools are going to play in this community is going to be an ongoing discussion. And, as I've always told Tom, I don't right now enjoy the assessment that the city does. I'm a city resident. I'm quite pleased with city services. I am very proud of city government and the way the assessment for me as a taxpayer is good. I'm sitting here with all of us with an assessment that says our secondary system particularly is not servicing kids. It's unacceptable. Do something about it. That struggle, that dilemma of the place of education, the value of it, and the cost of fixing it is all part of something that needs to be a shared discussion as we move into the future.
I think that's very true. I think that there are some things that are finite and some things that are not. I think we really all agree that that education plays a very important role and that it has to play a very important role. I'm not sure where it is we start to disagree. I guess that it is probably at the level of how can you make more efficient use of the resources. We don't know the answer to that question yet. I think that's going to be an ongoing discussion for the next 2 years. I think it's important that we carry it on in a way that respects the questions that are raised by each side, regardless of who thinks their line is being invaded. Because if we don't, we will get to 1990 and not have an agreement that makes any sense to anybody. So I think it's important that we keep in front of us the fact that we have agreed that schools are very important, that educating children is very important, but we also have to figure out how do we best do that with diminishing resources, because that is the case in this community. It's going to get worse.
Ruth, when you use the word efficiency, you mean how can we do things more efficiently?
How can we all do them more efficiently?
I think
How can we use the dollars more effectively?
Yeah, I think that, unfortunately, it's probably been an impression created that, at least on the city side, there's a land of plenty. I mean, you know, we've got 1,000 fewer employees than we had 12 years ago. I mean, our budgets have gone up less than the consumer price index over the last 5 or 6 years. So there is a lot of pressure on the budget. But at the same time, we have, in terms of per capita income, the city resident, of all the municipalities, has the lowest per capita income in this metropolitan area, and yet the highest real estate tax burden. Those things have to have an impact on decisions that are made about where people are going to live, where industries are going to locate. And that's the only question we raise. I think when we say that we ought to think in terms, so that fiscal independence agreement is not an appropriation on an annual basis. It's an allocation of taxing authority. And I you know, not just to plug in the full 60%. 65 cents on every dollar now that's levied for the real estate tax in the city is for the school district. And I think that's, you know, and that's the one revenue source that we have some control over. And I think that's and Peter, you know, the auditors tell you how you spent the money last year and the year before. They don't talk about what's going to happen in the future years. And so you made $9 million in cuts, but the total budget went up $22 or $23 million.
Can I respond to that?
I think, you know, that's the point that has to be remembered.
Go ahead. I also want a specific response to the concern that you're taxing at the limit and have no surplus to fall back on.
All right, but when I just come back to that one, I think Tom touched upon, I think, a very crucial point of where some of the dilemma and the struggle is, and I think the struggle is legitimate on both sides. On the one hand, the city has to struggle with the fact that the tax base is diminishing, that the burden on each taxpayer is now going up, and the fact that the attractiveness to this city in terms of business interests is based upon the tax structure and so forth. On the other side of the coin, you have that very same business being attracted to a city based on its educational quality. You have citizens who can afford to pay taxes, who have the income, being attracted or not attracted to the city based on its educational quality. Somehow we're in a chicken and egg situation in which both sides are dependent upon being able to look at interests on both sides and saying we got to protect these interests for the benefit of the whole. And somehow we have to come together and talk about the limited amount of resources to do both kinds of jobs. And I think that's where the struggle comes back and forth, because you have educational advocates on one side.
It is a question of balance, and I think that's the message that we
says
well,
that.
then let's go to the, like the CGR report also said that the budget submitted to the city, this one that we're now in, does have the kind of capacity to meet normal contingencies. I mean, it said this budget meets all the criteria that anybody would want to be in a budget. I mean, we even got accolades from the city staff in terms of this is what we've been waiting for. So I don't know what the question is in that sense. Is education going up in expense? Yes. Are there results? If you've taken a look at even the last 3 to 5 years, within this issue of priorities, where we've put the money, into early childhood centers, into early intervention programs, we're coming out with results in the next couple of weeks based on last year's indicators that suggest the elementary school, where we have focus, where we've got measurable objectives, are doing fine. They are moving. Now that's nice to hear. The secondary schools, which were the harder thing to affect, we reorganized. I'm expecting to see the outcomes in terms of attendance, suspension changes there this year. I think performance is going to take a little time at that level. But this discussion, I never feel like we get it down to, okay, whatever decisions you did make on this, quote, fast track for change, those investments we're making, are we getting some results? To the extent we're getting the results, is that better? I mean, is it okay to spend it? I don't have easy answers for some of this stuff. But the image that we're on the
are you
edge
Peter,
Let me
of...
raise
but Peter,
something
the
with-
point is not the, I mean, and that's why we talked about getting a center. I mean, and rather than have the two budget staffs between the school district and the city having an ongoing debate for 6 months, if we had the Center for Governmental Research, which I think they're familiar with the city finances, the school district, and everything else, you know, fairly well-respected organization in the community. But what we were talking about was the impact on future fiscal years. I mean, you know, the 89 budget is going to be balanced. It is balanced. What we're worried about, the decisions that are made this year obviously have an impact on budgets 2, 3, 4 years from now. And what we were talking about in terms of the affordability question was strictly what's out there 2 or 3 years from now. And that's the only question we raised.
Okay.
Well, the
So that-
study, too, I think we need to point out, too, that one of the things that the study suggested was that when the district adopted the current salary, and I'm not talking about the level of the salary from any personal kind of bias on it, but when they adopted it, that you did not know what the impact was, what the impact was going to be, what the cost was going to be. All we're saying on our side of the street is, whatever you do, make sure that you know what the cost is before you do it, because if you don't, we're going to find ourselves at the end of this budget year saying, oh my goodness, we didn't know what the cost was, we have this that's
All right,
happened,
we
we've got to
just
make
have
these
about
cuts.
Peter, is that
30
your
seconds
impression?
quickly
They didn't
left.
say that. Well,
Peter
wait a minute, I
McWalters.
can't, wait a second.
Well,
The
we
analysis
have
done
to-
by, the analysis done by
respond to that.
CGR on our estimates when we signed that contract came within plus or minus 0.5% on every one of the cost estimates.
And the center said
They
there
didn't
was
say
no single document.
Is
with
the
with
basis of all
cost.
of this a lack of communication? I mean,
We-
you're all
we-
very
well,
respectful
yeah.
of each
We
other.
should say
and
we
have
disagree with that
assumptions.
assessment. We think we
That's-
know very well what the cost was, and we
That's
projected
right.
it. And what we're saying that in the CGR report,
They-
that even though their estimates may not have agreed with us, they were only off a small percentage here and there. So that if you stood back and look at the aggregate total, you would say, by and large, these assessments agree between the CGR and the school district. So it's
All right.
unfair and incorrect to suggest that
Okay,
the school
that's going to
district
do
did
it
not.
for us. Thank you all for being with us today. See you next week on 2740. Good night.